Medical Innovation Forum. Thank you all so much for being here. We want to again acknowledge our sponsors and our deep gratitude to each of them, particularly Boston Scientific, our presenting sponsor, and then our stakeholding sponsors, General Electric, Lilly, Pfizer, Novartis, and Amgen. Many, many thanks to them. And finally, our participating sponsors, AstraZeneca, Bayer, Barrett, Edwards, Slavin, Novo Nordisk, and our media sponsor, STAT. My real job this morning is to welcome back to the podium our co-chairs, Dr. Callum McRae and Dr. Tony Rosenzweig. They're going to give us a quick recap on yesterday, they'll give us a look forward for today, and then introduce the moderator for our first panel.
Chris, thank you very much, and welcome back, everybody. I think yesterday we really started off with an amazing day. A lot of optimism, evidence of remarkable investments in discovery and innovation and in translation in the cardiovascular and metabolic space. But we also heard of some challenges that I think are emerging as themes in the evolving picture of the cardiovascular metabolic disease area. Those were mainly challenges in data needs. That's one of the things that I heard, and I think we're going to hear these themes developing over the next day and a half. Perhaps the thing that struck me most was a sense that at every level, at disease subset level, at stratification, in discovery, in moving new interventions and therapies to the clinic, and in building patient-centered systems, there was a need for different types of data, and data that had to really be put together into a different ecosystem, one that really, as I think many of yesterday's speakers emerged, has to really be thought of in a patient-centric way. And it was exciting to hear everybody really well aligned around those goals, and I hope over the next day and a half we'll actually begin to explore, or continue to explore rather, how we might solve some of these challenges together in a collaborative and innovative way. Tony.
Callum, I agree completely. I think we heard a great deal of optimism about what is going to be possible in the future, especially working collaboratively, but a real need for the identification of clinically meaningful subgroups of patients so that we could target therapy. I think we heard some of the successes of device development over the past decade, but also a recognition that drug development has lagged behind that, and the hope that we could put the biology and the mechanics of these systems together in a meaningful way to really improve therapy in the future. I think the other thing that was a theme was the need for innovation, but the need to generate new approaches that will enable us to pay for innovation. And so I think it's particularly apt that we have this next panel here that's going to be addressing pricing to enable both affordability and innovation. And so it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Peter Slavin, who's the president of the Massachusetts General Hospital since 2003. Peter is a friend and colleague whom I've known since internship together just a couple of years ago. You know, I think what I deeply admire about Peter and am deeply grateful for is his strong moral compass. So I think as Peter wrestles with these difficult decisions that a president of a large healthcare system needs to deal with, I think it always comes through how strongly he's committed to all four of our core missions, and how deeply he cares about the things that we can do to improve the lives of our patients, to improve the issues of disparities in healthcare delivery, diversity in the workforce, and what we can do for our communities. So I think I can think of no one better than Peter to really chair this session. So please join me in welcoming Peter Slavin for chairing the next panel on enabling affordability and innovation through pricing. Thanks very much, Peter.
Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see all these early morning risers here with us this morning, and just want to add my welcome to Chris's and others, welcoming you to this World Medical Innovation Forum. I want to congratulate Chris Coburn and his colleagues at Partners Innovation for the third time in a row putting together a great event, and thank Tony and Callum for doing such a great job helping program this event focused on cardiac disease. I am privileged to be joined by four terrific panelists who are going to be discussing the tension between affordability and innovation. To my immediate left is Katrina Armstrong, the physician-in-chief at Mass General Hospital and Jackson Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. To Katrina's left is Paul Fonteyne, the CEO of Boehringer Ingelheim, USA. To his left is Robert Ford, the Executive Vice President for Medical Devices at Abbott. And then to the far left is Ben Scirica, who is the Director of Innovation within the Cardiovascular Division at the Brigham and a Senior Investigator in this TIMI study group. So I think we have a terrific panel here to discuss these important issues. And I think it's appropriate that three people from academia surrounding two from industry. So we'll try to keep them under some degree of control. I will just maybe spend a minute or two outlining, at least from my perspective, the issues that I think we're going to try to touch upon in the next 48 minutes. Clearly, having the U.S. in a leadership role in devices and biopharmaceuticals is a wonderful place for us to be, and it seems that to me that it brings at least three benefits to our society. The first is the wonderful products that help patients' lives, make them healthier, live longer. Second is the enormous economic stimulus that it provides. It's estimated that this industry employs directly a couple of 100,000 people in this country, and also stimulates indirectly millions of jobs, and contributes close to $1 trillion to our economy. And last but not least, this industry helps support biomedical research within academia, teaching hospitals, medical schools, universities around the country, and at a time when the NIH budget is stagnant, fortunately doesn't appear to be going down at the moment, that support from industry to help advance knowledge in medicine is enormously important. But all of those things come at a price, and I guess there are two, at least from my perspective, two major criticisms that have been levied against these industries. One is that the American consumer, is paying much more for the benefits of their products than similar consumers around the world, and is that pricing disparity between the U.S. and other countries fair, justifiable, and sustainable? And then secondly, particularly in recent years, it's been drugs, devices, I think to a lesser extent, that have been major forces in driving up healthcare costs in this country. And obviously there are some drugs that have come on the market in recent years that are extraordinarily expensive, well beyond the reach of individuals, families to pay for, and setting off very tense discussions between families, insurance companies about coverage issues. And so the high cost of drugs, when they're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, raises all sorts of issues as well. So this panel is really all about how do we balance those pluses and minuses, and how do we come up with policies that try to untie this, break up this Gordian knot to some degree. I wanted to start with Paul and Robert and ask them to provide us with a little bit of a primer on this topic. I'm sure a number of people in this room know exactly how drugs and devices are priced, but I think there are a number of people like myself in academia to whom it's a bit of a mystery. And so I guess I'd like to ask first Paul and then Robert to maybe explain in a few minutes how they think about pricing within the walls of their companies, and then who are the major parties outside of the companies that they have to deal with that ultimately result in the prices that our market sees. So, Paul?
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everyone. I'll start from the pharmaceutical side, and then Robert will approach the device side. From the perspective of historical pricing of pharmaceuticals, clearly the discussions that precede a decision on that try to involve as many stakeholders as possible. and try to understand where the range, because this is more of an art than a science, the range of possible decision points would be around pricing of pharmaceuticals based on medical cost offsets, based on pricing of available therapies, and a few other factors such as benefit design. And that's historically, and I've been in this industry for 32 years, that's historically how the pricing of pharmaceuticals has been approached. In the last, I would say the last 5 to 10 years, the fun facts of what is really the price of pharmaceuticals should be appreciated. It's clear that the distance between the list price and the net price that the manufacturer collects is widened, meaning that about 60% of the list price of a pharmaceutical gets collected by the manufacturer. All the rest is, quote unquote, intermediated with certain elements of the supply chain, be it a plan, be it a hospital, be it a wholesaler, and. That then led to a discussion of, especially in the rise of high deductible plans in the commercial sector, of how are we actually helping patients afford their medicines when they're faced with high deductibles, which in the last few years has become more prevalent, up to about 40 to 50% of the commercial segment right now. One of the things as an industry, but as BI, we would support is to make sure that in those situations, so I'm fast forwarding now, Peter, in those situations, the patient is exposed to the net price, not the full price, because that could reduce significantly the out-of-pocket costs during that period. It's also important to appreciate that there is an important backlog of generic drugs, because this is all about freeing up resources so that new technologies can be adopted quickly and render benefit quickly. We've advocated on the Hill and anywhere we're given the opportunity to solve the following problem. It takes about a year to get an innovative pharmaceutical approved. It takes about 36 months to get a generic approved. How do we make these two things the same? That will create far more generics on the market for products that currently don't have them, and create a bolus of resources which will be able to be invested. Today, let's not forget, close to 90% of the medicines dispensed in the Medicare benefit program are generics, and if we could continue to bring that up, it will create money for innovative therapies that we all need. So.
Great. Robert?
Yeah, I think that we're at a transformative moment as it relates to kind of innovation and access. There are no more funds in the system. If one product or technology gets covered, it comes at the expense of something else. There's no new money. So I think that needs to really transform the way we're thinking about our role to not only develop innovation to improve lives, but also our role broadly in society. At Abbott, at least in the businesses that I run, we go about it with 3 key questions that we ask ourselves in the development phase of new products. First question we ask is there a need? Is there a medical need? Is it sustainable, et cetera? The second question is, can we make it? Can we make it at the right cost position? Can we make it with the quality that's required? And 3, who's going to pay for it and why? And those 3 questions need to be constantly asked and challenged throughout the whole development phase. At every phase gate, those 3 questions need to be asked and answered. And I would say, historically, we haven't been that good at answering the last question. Who's going to pay for it and why? And we've made, I'd think, some mistakes. I could talk for Abbott in terms of some of the products that we've kind of developed and put into the market because we haven't appropriately answered that last question, who's going to pay for it and why? And I think that that's kind of the key challenge that we need to kind of push ourselves on. One of the things that we try to push a lot is how do we challenge the brain power of the development teams to not only deliver on outcomes and solve the problem, but to actually challenge them to bring down the cost of the technology, not 10 years from now, not 5 years from now, but in 12 months, in 18 months from now. A lot of the times we develop studies that show cost savings, 5, 6, 7 years. And while those are important, they cannot be the central part of our value proposition. We need to address the cost issue kind of immediately, almost like immediately in the first 12 months. So we think about answering those 3 questions and ensuring that that 3rd question, we have a clear, measurable reasons as to why that technology needs to be paid for and by who.
Thank you. Katrina, maybe I'd ask you from the perspective of a primary care physician as well as the leader of a number of inpatient, outpatient practices and significant academic program. What are the major challenges that you see as a result of the current pricing system for drugs and devices in this country?
Well, Peter, I just want to thank everybody here for coming again, getting up in the morning. And I think that there's a number of challenges that we face, and I think you all have hit a lot. I very much agree that we're at a moment in time where we just have an extraordinary opportunity to translate this investment that we've made in understanding human biology into how we're taking care of our patients, both in primary care and on the specialty services. I often joke when I recruit residents to MGH that despite all of that, when I round on the inpatient services, half the time we're doing the exact same thing that we did when you and I were training. I usually say we're either giving people fluid or we're taking it away, and that's 90% of what we do. But if you think about what's in development in your guys' companies or how we're doing it, the opportunity to bring that to our patients, I think, is really extraordinary and is not happening right now. And I think it's not happening for a couple of different reasons. I will say one of the big tragedies from my perspective is that the current financing system really puts all the money into treating at the end stage of disease. So that's where the money is. That's when you say who's going to pay for it and why. We're going to pay for it because the way we finance healthcare right now is to put the money at the end. Whereas if we think about all of us in this room or my primary care patients, where they need and want innovation is before they get sick. They want to be kept healthy. They want somebody to keep them out of the hospital. And so that's a huge gap, Peter, that I think we could do a whole lot more about in terms of how we push this unbelievable industry to actually innovate in a different area that has so much opportunity. Mm-hmm. And then I will just say, I think the drug costs are a real issue for my patients. It's not just an issue for our communities, right? I think, as you said, Robert, where is there more money, right? So what's happening as we look at communities in terms of the opportunity costs of where we're putting our money right now, we have to think about how that's affecting business, how healthcare costs are affecting our economic productivity, how they're affecting our ability for states to actually fund programs. And I think that's a fundamental issue. But even for individual patients, as we know, I do cancer research, not cardiology, I will say. But as we look at cancer patients, the out-of-pocket costs that they're facing right now are causing an enormous proportion of them actually to not fill prescriptions. So they're written a prescription for a new medicine that we think has a major value to them, and they leave it at the pharmacy because they simply can't pay the out-of-pocket costs. There's some data we have now to suggest that up to 30 or 40% of those prescriptions are actually never filled just because of those out-of-pocket costs. So that's a travesty, I think, in terms of what we could be doing for our patients if we could get this refocused and really change how we are moving innovation forward.
Mm-hmm. Ben, I ask you the same question I asked Katrina. What are the major issues from your perspective as an academic cardiologist at the Brigham?
I think there are a couple issues, and I agree with Katrina that part of the problem is that we're focusing really on these episodic and sort of end of life or end of disease episodes where it's a lot of cost, and the truth is we can't move the needle a lot when we get into a disease at that state. And so we have to think of what is the appropriate perspective, not 30 days, not 90 days. When we're talking about a lot of the cardiometabolic diseases, we're talking about decades and decades. And the good news is we have a lot of data in cardiology, particularly about medicines, about how to reduce those risk factors. And the good news is a lot of the drugs that do it are generic or near generic, or they're not specialty drugs. So we could do a lot on innovation just by identifying the patients, getting them on the drugs so that they don't get to those high-cost episodic episodes later in life. I think cardiology is now challenged from the medical side because we do have some high-cost drugs that we have not had before, and we are likely in some of the most transformative medicines that are coming down the line may also be high-cost specialty drugs. And the truth is, I think when you're thinking of oncology, when you're talking of thousands or tens of thousands of patients, there may be an appetite for 10,000 plus a year drug cost. When we're talking about 100 million patients or plus, that's just not a sustainable model in terms of the overall healthcare. As a clinician, when I'm seeing a patient, I want to get them the drug that they are going to benefit from. But I think we have to do better in trying to maximize what we are using in terms of the low-cost generic drugs, and then have a better identification for the patients who really do derive the greatest absolute risk reduction from the high-cost drugs, and have a economic and responsibility horizon much beyond just the next 30 days, the next 2 years, and much more on a lifetime. And that's beyond what many payers, many institutions look at. And many of these drugs we're doing, especially in the lipids, the least effect is actually in the first 2 years. It's over longer term where you're going to get that type of benefit.
Great. So I've been in healthcare management for more years than I'd like to admit. And I think for almost all of those years, there's been talk that we should change the reimbursement system for drug companies, device manufacturers, pay for value, pay for outcomes, pay on a more capitated basis. So that plane has been going down the runway for decades and yet never seems to get much lift. Paul, what should we aspire for that plane to get lift? Yep. And if so, what's it going to take to do so?
As a company, and I think I can speak for the industry, we're very much in favor of what has been baptized the value-based programs. And what that means is all interventions helping patients deal with a particular condition be part of a either capitated or shared rewards program where drugs is just one of the pieces of intervention that the physicians and the health systems choose to enable. So we are more than happy to participate in a world that evolves to something that is truly based on the value that we actually provide and get paid for that. And as a couple of you mentioned, the more precision medicine takes hold, the more that's going to be possible. Mm-hmm. And obviously, the smaller the populations that are affected by an individual compound will be. And in that realm, then the benefit design becomes very important. We have to have a benefit design that treats, first, that allows a value-based discussion and that treats pharmaceuticals, hospital, and medical interventions in a similar way. Right now, if you look at the out-of-pocket costs that patients face, because of the benefit designs they face, the biggest part of their exposure as a percentage is on the drug side. And so that creates an imbalance that might be totally against the preventative methods that were advocated for earlier, because usually the best way to prevent hospital admissions is to maximize the non-hospitalized interventions, in which pharmaceuticals play a big role. Sure.
Robert, your thoughts on that topic, and maybe any specific examples?
Well, I kind of echo that, and I think we're very supportive of that too. I also understand a little bit of the frustration. We've been talking about this for so long. I think that the ecosystem is set up to incenting that model. It's across all stakeholders in the system. So it's very difficult to kind of completely disrupt and change that. I think that picking a couple areas and kind of really focusing on changing that specific area entirely is something that I think is the right way to go about it. I think CMS has started to do some of that in orthopedics, for example, in terms of putting it all together. So it's not necessarily you're paying for a hip replacement, you're paying for the whole entire procedure, and with outcomes associated with no repeat visits after 30 days, et cetera, and paying for that. I think that's a good model to start, but I think it's very difficult to kind of trying to hug the entire world and say, okay, we're going to change everything all at once. I think picking a couple areas and kind of really going in deep and launching that value-based system is probably the way to go.
Right. Ben, any areas within cardiology that you think would be ripe for this sort of reimbursement approach?
I think there are. I mean, I think it's challenging with the orthopedic comparison because we're sort of dealing with some of these bundled cares now for MI in Massachusetts, and orthopedic hip replacement, for example. Somebody comes in, they're walking into the doctor, it's planned. There's a pretty set course, and probably 6 months afterwards, you should be in good shape. For MI, it's an acute event. There are multiple different, is it cardiogenic shock? Is it a little bit of a non-ST elevation MI? To try to bundle a care around that is going to be much more complicated. And much of the costs can be from the inpatient and also depending on the severity of the post-care. So I think it's going to be a less of an easy calculus than the bundled care for elective orthopedic surgeries. Mm-hmm. I think more that it is where I see a better value proposition is when we look at some of the chronic disease states and where we are managing somebody's diabetes, pre-diabetes, lipids, or heart failure, where it's sort of therapeutic agnostic, but what's the most cost-effective way, efficient way to manage these chronic conditions, knowing that there are evidence-based reductions in high-cost hospitalizations. And we know the therapies that are out there that should be good. We're just not doing it in a way that is leading to the best utilization of those drugs.
And Katrina, one of the challenges that we face in this space is not just the pricing, but the utilization. In medicine, we overutilize certain drugs, devices, and we also underutilize drugs and devices. What can we do to clean up our act and use these expensive agents or devices more appropriately?
No, I think that's such an important point. I mean, if we look at, as we think about that big, $1 trillion thing that we talk about, there's obviously two ways to take that on. One is to think about how we're pricing things and recognize, are there opportunities to actually lower the cost of goods, right? To actually make us, there's always this old story that we're one of the only industries that as we innovate, we get more expensive. We don't get less expensive. And so how do we actually innovate to lower the true cost of drug development, of device development, so that we're actually able to deliver it for less and still incentivize innovation? But the other obvious big part is how do we actually figure out who should get what and actually think about the better targeting, both in a value-based model, right? So that we're able to figure out for a bundle who is going to benefit from a different drug or a different device or even a different healthcare intervention. And then I think the holy grail is how do we actually get them to do that, right? So I think one of the things, I used to spend a lot of time with health economists in my prior life, and one of the great things about health economists is that they love studying the healthcare system because physicians are completely unexplainable. They're the only economic phenomena that out there that behaves completely irrationally at all time. And so I think one of the challenges that we have, Peter, is that physicians are individuals. They have very strong beliefs. I will tell you, coming to the Harvard environment, that a lot of those seem to be imprinted during your internship because that is a major focus here. And so I think we've got to recognize that we need to really take it on in three ways. One is I think, absolutely have to engage patients in this. Patient engagement is fundamental to actually how we're going to take this issue on so the patients start to really engage, understanding their own health, their own precision medicine, what are the right options for them? Because without engagement, they're not going to take these drugs. They're not going to figure out how to stick on the long-term drugs that Ben's talking about. People fall off very quickly from those types of therapies. So patient engagement is a huge area for innovation that we're just not doing enough in, and would benefit everybody. Benefit the companies, it would benefit the delivery system, and it would benefit our patients. And then I think we've got to do better at how we provide doctors the support for making the right decision. And right now, I think just as Callum said this morning, I think it's got to be about how are we getting the right data? How are we actually letting doctors understand the precision, the data that are needed to decide about which drug, which actual device is going to help those individuals? We now recognize not everybody benefits from these things. In fact, it's only a minority of the patients that are actually experiencing the benefit. So we need to get that information to the point of care, figure out what it is. And I think those are opportunities, but I will say my sense is that we're probably going to be herding those cats for some time, Peter.
But I would just sort of echo in the cardiovascular, if we could figure out of all the ICDs that go in, the actual patients who are going to benefit from them, or the patients who are going for AFib ablation, who's going to get a durable response, and not have to do it in the other patients, there's a lot of resources that could be used in different areas in that type of situation.
Some from the audience highlighted the issue, one of the issues that I raised at the beginning, namely the price disparity between the U.S. and the rest of the world, and questioned whether that led to better or worse care here in the U.S. Robert, I guess I'll start with you on this one. How big an issue do you think that is from your perspective, and what can we as a country do about it?
I think it's a huge issue, and I think that one of the things that we're working on as we're developing our new products is, as we're developing our pricing strategy, we're looking at how do we establish kind of global pricing models, so that the only difference between what a payer or a consumer pays in one country and the other is the exchange rate to the dollar. And I think that that's an area that we're actively working on. We've launched a product in the field of diabetes where we have established a global pricing, and we've looked at it from a pricing it to the standard of care. The premium is relatively modest. We believe it's a fair price, and with that conviction, we can then establish to say, okay, this is a fair price across the world. What a patient pays in China is the same what a patient's going to pay in the U.S., same as a patient pays in Europe. And I think that when you have this kind of disparity of prices, it creates a lot of incentives that aren't good for the system, where a product gets purchased in one country and gets shipped to another country, to a series of other implications to kind of innovation and kind of where we're spending and investing our money. So I think that global pricing strategies are something that I'm seeing more of as companies are launching products to basically have it. But there's much work to be done there for sure. But it needs to start.
Yeah. Paul?
Agree with everything my esteemed colleagues said. We do the same thing. We are approaching, first of all, we think it's a huge issue. We think it's unfair. And we are actually at the point of not launching medicines in certain markets. And these are not exactly poor countries. These are EU5 type of countries. And because we are very conscious of this band of what he called global pricing model that falls within acceptable variability, and just are frustrated by the impact of price controls outside of the United States, and want to maintain that band within a logical range, and want to take a position which is a hot potato politically at the moment also around importation, because we don't want to import price controls into this country. And we also don't want to create drug shortage around the world by endeavoring to supply a huge market like the US from a very small market like Canada, for example. And so that is all falls within a range of issues that the industry has worked on for many years. But it all starts here in terms of pricing our products in a way that makes sense into the United States, and then solving for the rest of the world, honestly.
Thank you both for that. A lot of people hold out hope that precision medicine may be an important way to address these issues if we can get smarter identifying subgroups of patients who are likely to benefit from drugs. We can stop wasting the use of drugs in patients who aren't going to benefit. And yet there are huge costs associated with defining those subgroups, costs of genetic testing, et cetera. And so, Katrina, I'm just curious how optimistic, how bullish are you about the ability of precision medicine to improve care and also reduce the cost of these costly supplies?
Well, Peter, I do think, I remember one of the first times you and I ever met, I had just written a piece arguing in favor of that, and I think you told me that I was crazy. I do think that, there's two different ways to think about the role, or many ways, but two key ways to think about the role that precision medicine is going to play here. I think fundamentally we're in the game of precision medicine because it's going to make better outcomes for our patients. Because right now we are delivering drugs with complications, side effects to individuals who are actually not benefiting from those drugs. And I'm incredibly bullish on that, like unbelievably bullish on that we are going to come to a point where in cardiology, when they see a patient on the services, they are really going to understand the drivers of that disease and be able to target the fundamental problems for that patient, not just hope that they're somehow like the 10,000 other patients that were put in that trial. So I think that is incredibly bullish. I think whether or not it truly drives down drug costs has really more to do about whether or not it drives down our cost of the overall pharmaceutical or industry or device budgets, really has more to do about whether or not there's innovation there for those industries. So to the degree that we can actually figure out how to improve outcomes for those patients in other ways that enable us to better target those therapies, but reward innovation in these companies, I think it's going to be the key issue. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. I mean, I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say, but it's still a pretty divided industry from my perspective. So the people who are actually focusing on the precision medicine applications, the genomic applications, the diagnostic tests, the ways that we're actually going to figure out, even in a value-based model, which drugs are working for which patients, at least in my perspective, have been very separate from the pharmaceutical companies or the device companies that are still, I think, in a model of just thinking about how do we get something through the FDA using an old model. My guess is that true innovation is going to take bringing those things together. Startup companies that think from the very beginning about how do we identify a subset, how do we bring those pieces together. I think if we do that, we're going to drive down costs in the industry and we're going to do better for our patients.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to take on that also. I think on the device side, one of the things, also the bed said, is how do we take the data that's currently in and residing and being generated by these devices, whether it's an ICD, whether it's an implantable monitor, and kind of leverage the power of that data. So I think using that data to be able to kind of look at, okay, how can we use data coming out of an ICD, for example, to prevent, develop algorithms to prevent kind of, further heart failure, for example. That's where I see a lot of some of our innovation going, which is taking the data from these devices and kind of being able to use some of that data to provide a value to the system to say, okay, not only it can help with the actual condition, but let me take the data from it and say where we can go a step further and use that in a preventative fashion. I think that's going to be another kind of wave, at least on the device side.
Right.
I can give you, Peter, real-world experience on that. We have a couple of compounds where the FDA actually mandated us developing with a partner the testing procedure as well as the medicine, and came to market with both of them in oncology. And that seems to have worked reasonably well. That's one side of the innovation, which attaches to a new drug. I think there's a lot of potential also in existing medicines and trying to refine where they truly deliver the best bang for the buck.
Great. Somebody here in the audience named Ike, who's asked a couple of terrific questions on my mini iPad here. I'm going to ask one that I hadn't thought of leading up to this panel. I'll direct it to you, Ben. He writes that placebos have been found to be incredibly effective. In value-based care, will doctors get paid to prescribe placebos? So I guess more broadly, what role should the use of placebos have in our healthcare system?
We often joke in our clinical trials that the best thing you could hope to be is randomized into the placebo arm of a randomized clinical trial, and mass, you'll do better. I mean, I think there is. I think what that speaks to is the fact that you can't just write a script and expect somebody to stay on it for the rest of their life if they're going to need to be on it. And I think what comes with the placebo is the fact that the patient does understand or think that they're getting something that is going to benefit them. And hopefully we're giving them the drug that is going to benefit it, that they actually believe it. If somebody comes in thinking, you're going to rot out my liver, then they're not going to fill the script or take it long. If they think it is something that is going to really lengthen their life, make their quality of life better, it's going to do that. And so I think the placebo, I see it more as that we have to have the better patient engagement, as Katrina said, in terms of the patient realizing what they're doing. I mean, somebody comes out of the hospital with an MI, otherwise looked healthy beforehand, wasn't healthy, but looked healthy beforehand. They're on 5 or 6 evidence-based medicines. And that is a lot of problems, and the chance of them being on all of those in 1 month, let alone 6 months, is pretty small. And I think that's where we do fall apart a lot in even trying to get those drugs to people, and they don't understand why they're on them.
Right. Any other comments about placebos?
I think one of the interesting phenomena I might be interested in, is this move to how much are we going to be able to drive down drug costs or other development by changes in how we think about using real-world evidence for drug approval and for other issues. And that's always, I think, going to run up into this concern about placebo effects, right? And so, I rely on placebo effects not only in my practice, but I think in the department constantly. And so actually with my children. And so I think we all use placebo effects, but I think we also have to hold ourselves to a standard of understanding that a lot of people will argue they feel better when you do something to them. And we want to drive down drug cost development. We want to make the FDA more responsive. We want to get things out there faster to our patients. But this placebo effect would argue we've got to be really careful because we may be paying a whole lot for something that's not better than a sugar pill in the fundamental part of it.
And conversely, I mean, I am with some of the legislation that's out there in terms of maybe under or decreasing the prioritization of randomized trials. I always have a healthy dose of skepticism with the real world observations. I don't think you can disentangle the inherent biases and confounding by treatment when you're looking even at several hundred thousands, millions of patients and trying to compare a drug that some doctors decided to give to this patient and didn't decide to give to that. And I think we have gotten ourselves into a bit of a problem in terms of our clinical trials are very expensive. They're very labor intensive. And FDA has spoken a lot about pragmatic trials. But I think what we found, and certainly is that when we'll do a trial and we'll try to be a bit lighter on monitoring, then in the review process, there's a concern about a heart rate missing at visit 13 or something, and that then adds additional concern and delay in the approval. And so I think pragmatic trials that don't cost as much, even with approved drugs, but even for unapproved drugs, are a extremely important way to try to not only bring new technology, new therapies to market cheaper, but also identify different populations on approved drugs that may benefit from these agents. And I think we're trying to develop platforms to do these pragmatic trials where you can reconsider what type of monitoring you need. Does the informed consent need to be as extensive as it would in a classic clinical trial for drugs that are out there?
We've had success, to that point, Ben, we've had success in terms of developing kind of an RCT trial that's scientifically kind of strong enough to kind of stand the test. But parallel to that, also kind of develop a real-world trial. So you actually have kind of two of them going at the same time. And we've actually had two great examples of kind of being able to see kind of the RCT deliver the same kind of results as the real-world evidence, or vice versa, however you see. I think that's something that at least we're looking at, is how do you build both of them and kind of power both of them.
Let me just, Paul, we were talking about this before the panel. Last year, the 21st Century Cures Act passed the Congress, was signed into law by President Obama, and there were multiple facets to that piece of legislation. In academia, we were focused on the NIH budget increases, or at least the authorization for budget increases, which probably has now set the groundwork for the $2 billion increase that we seem to be on the verge of. But you mentioned that there were also important pieces in that legislation that have the potential to streamline drug development and the approval process. Maybe you could comment on
that legislation is useful with regards to providing an impetus to FDA to write down guidance to industry to, by a certain point in time, usually 18 or 19, to give us the opportunity to include pragmatic trials, real-world evidence into the labels for those compounds. I think that's going to be a slow process, but I don't think we have a choice. I think we have to engage in that because the cost of the traditional RCTs are unlikely to be sustainable, especially in the United States. And we want to be able to continue to do clinical trial work in the U.S. And for many, especially in primary care medicines, which we're a dedicated primary care company for the most part, is becoming totally unsustainable. So the first place we are approaching this is not in your initial approval of a compound, but in claims augmentation. So for example, you have an FEV1 claim and you want to go to exacerbations or something like that, so that you can you already have a base of safety and efficacy that you're knowledgeable about, and you're trying to describe the benefit further. Let's see how that goes. I think that impetus in 21st Century Cures, whatever comes out of the next PDUFA reauthorization of the FDA, how do these two work streams then provide further impetus for us to do, whether you call them pragmatic trials or real-world evidence, taking into effect the limitations of that versus an RCT. I think that's obvious to everyone.
Right. So Ben, you do RCTs as a major part of your work. Do you think, even for secondary indications, that we should settle for weaker evidence?
I'm really, I'll have to say, skeptical that we can, especially for hard mortality cardiovascular events, identify things from observational trial. I think the irrationality of physicians, or at least the multiple different rationalities that each physician uses, makes the observational data challenging. I think it's important to understand the practice patterns, the barriers to delivery, but I think if you develop a platform where it's much easier to test simple questions, you can, at a much more cost-effective scale, be able to answer some of these. But I think in cardiology, where we've seen a lot of observational findings not pan out in the randomized trials, where I think we don't have very good surrogates, honestly, intermediate surrogates in the ischemic and heart failure world in particular, trying to do observational data to even look at some of the secondary endpoints, I think, is challenging. Mm-hmm.
Katrina, you've spent much of your career in health services research.
No, absolutely, Peter. And I guess I will disagree with Ben here. I think the challenge is, how much money do we have to spend? And how important is the question, right? I mean, everybody wants to spend more money. I would argue we just don't have more money to spend right now. And not only do we not have more money, but we're not spending it on stuff that could have the biggest impact upon our patients. So I think we've got to hold ourselves accountable and ask, like, how much do we really need another $100 million trial to look at a secondary outcome of a drug that we already know saves lives. And do we need it? And no offense here to my colleagues, because we're going to change the market share of that drug, or do we need it because we're actually going to change what is experienced by our patients? So I would argue that we absolutely have to drive down the actual costs of making these drugs and devices and getting them to our patients for this to work. Some of it is pricing, but a lot of it is we really need to take our whole industry here with precision medicine, with the healthcare system, and really change how it costs what we do to deliver those things. So I'm going to say I'm not sure I would spend another $100 million in a randomized trial to do something that I don't think is going to change the fundamental experience of my patients or what's going on. And I would settle for evidence that I believe is true, that I think is unbiased, in order to actually be able to move forward in a way where we're going to deliver drugs at an affordable cost to our patients and our communities.
Well, I want to thank our 4 panelists for doing such a great job tackling a challenging topic. Obviously, a lot more questions than answers, but please help me thank Katrina, Paul, Robert, and Ben for participating in the World Medical Innovation Forum.